A dazzling night in a grand ballroom, where a millionaire and his mistress believe they can break a pregnant woman's spirit. In front of dozens of witnesses, the mistress kicks her chair and makes her fall, while the millionaire laughs as if her pain were a joke. What follows is not silence, but a storm of indignation, the arrival of justice, and a fall from power that no amount of money can stop. Believe me, you won't believe how it ends until we walk through it together. Tell us what time you're listening and where you're tuning in from. Leave a comment below, because we love to hear from you. The chandeliers glittered over the grand ballroom, their crystals scattering light onto the polished tables and champagne glasses. Laughter and polite conversation floated in the air as waiters carried trays of delicacies, moving among guests in elegant suits and formal gowns. It was the kind of evening meant to seem untouchable, a celebration of wealth and power where appearances mattered more than the truth. At the central table, a pregnant woman named Sarah sat in silence, her hand resting protectively on the curve of her belly. She shifted in her seat, uncomfortable not just from the weight of her child, but also from the heavy atmosphere surrounding her. The seat next to her was empty, though not because her husband was absent. He was on the other side of the room, leaning in too close to his mistress, whispering in her ear while she laughed with an exaggerated delight. The guests pretended not to notice, but the attention was impossible to ignore. Sarah's eyes fell. She had been through scenes like this before. The humiliation of being left alone while her husband paraded his affair in front of everyone no longer surprised her. But tonight it felt sharper, crueler. She gripped the edge of the table, forcing herself to remain calm, to breathe slowly, to keep her dignity intact, even as her world cracked a little more with each passing moment. The mistress, Chloe, noticed her gaze. That calculating, mocking smile spread across her face. She excused herself from the group with a sway of her hips, her heels echoing against the marble floor as she paraded toward the pregnant woman. The conversations in the room died down, as if the air itself sensed what was about to happen. The mistress stopped directly in front of Sarah's chair. She leaned in, her perfume overwhelming, her words dripping with mockery. "Look at you, sitting here all alone. Do you really think anyone cares?" Her voice was low, but it was heard clearly, and the few guests closest by looked away uncomfortably, refusing to meet Sarah's eyes. Sarah kept her lips pressed firmly together, refusing to respond. Silence was her only shield, but silence, to the mistress, was weakness. With a sudden and violent move, the mistress lifted her foot and kicked the leg of the chair. The force made the chair tilt backward. Sarah let out a gasp. Her arms flailed, searching for balance. One hand clung to her belly, the other pressed against the table, knocking over a wine glass that shattered against the marble floor. The sound resonated through the room, harsh and unforgiving. Exclamations of shock were heard. Guests rose from their seats, open-mouthed. Someone dropped a fork that clattered loudly. Another hand instinctively covered a child's eyes. The music from the string quartet stopped abruptly, leaving a silence so heavy it squeezed everyone's chest. Sarah's chair stabilized just before it fell completely, but her body trembled from the impact. Her breathing was ragged, her hand still clinging to her swollen belly. She blinked rapidly, fighting back tears, refusing to give the mistress the satisfaction of seeing her break. The mistress took a step back, satisfied, her lips curved into a smile. Her eyes shone with the cruel pleasure of knowing she had pushed Sarah to the brink of humiliation in front of the entire room. No one spoke. No one moved. Everyone understood that something unforgivable had just happened, something that could not be disguised as a misunderstanding or justified with excuses. The silence grew thick, heavy with judgment, as Sarah remained trembling, her dignity wounded, but not destroyed. And in that frozen instant, everyone knew that the night would no longer be remembered for the glittering chandeliers or the champagne. It would be remembered for one woman's cruelty and another's pain. The ballroom had never felt so quiet. After the echo of broken glass, an unnatural silence took hold of the place, swallowing every corner. Dozens of guests remained frozen in their seats, their eyes wide and their breaths held. Some held their phones halfway up, between recording and putting them down, unsure whether they should act or hide. Others looked nervously at the millionaire on the other side of the room, as if expecting him to intervene, but he did nothing. Sarah clutched her belly, her fingers trembling on the fabric of her dress. The child inside her seemed to stir with her fear. Each movement was intensified by the chaos around her. She leaned forward, her knuckles white on the edge of the table, trying to catch her breath. She could feel the stares on her skin, judging her, pitying her, or both. She wanted to disappear, but there was no escape. Her lips parted slightly. A trembling sigh escaped her. Tears welled in her eyes, though she forced herself to hold them back. Crying at that moment would mean giving the mistress a victory she didn't deserve. But the effort to repress it all left her body shaking, her chest heaving in the struggle to maintain composure. Whispers began to creep into the silence. A woman at a distant table leaned toward her husband, her voice sharp and horrified. "Did you see that? She could have fallen." A man nearby murmured something about calling security, though he didn't get up from his seat. The whispers spread like wildfire, turning into a murmur of disbelief that filled the room with nervous energy. The mistress remained standing a few feet away, her arms crossed over her chest, her smile intact. She fed on the gasps and the stares, on the power of having turned the entire room into her stage. She barely raised her chin, daring anyone to confront her. Sarah lowered her head, her hair falling over her face like a curtain that hid her expression. Inside, her heart was beating so hard she could barely hear the whispers. She wanted to scream, to defend herself, but her voice was choked in her throat. She clung to silence, a silence that made her seem small and fragile, but it was the only thing she had left. Across from her, a waiter cautiously approached, kneeling to pick up the pieces of glass. His hands trembled as he worked, aware that every movement resonated in the forced calm of the room. The clinking of the glass on the tray sounded louder than it should, each piece a reminder of the violence that had just occurred. The cry of a child broke the air for an instant, sharp and frightened. The mother calmed him immediately, clutching him to her chest, as if to protect him from a spectacle that was too cruel. The sound of the sobs added another layer of shame to the scene, highlighting how far this evening was from being normal. The guests began to exchange glances, their eyes going from the trembling wife to the victorious mistress. The silence was no longer empty. It was dense, suffocating, full of judgment and fear. Everyone knew that this was no longer a simple private marital scandal. It was a public humiliation, etched into the memory of every person present. Sarah closed her eyes for a moment, gathering the strength to lift her head. She inhaled deeply, forcing herself to steady her breathing. She felt the weight of her child inside her, reminding her that she couldn't fall apart. Not now. Slowly, she straightened her back, still with trembling hands, but with a firmer posture. She refused to crumble in front of them. The mistress's smile widened as she saw her, interpreting her silence as defeat. She tilted her head and murmured something to herself, a cruel comment that no one heard but everyone intuited. The air was still thick with tension, broken only by the murmur of whispers, the clinking of collected glass, and the ragged breathing of a woman fighting to maintain her dignity. Everyone in that room knew that the night was not over. The cruelty was just beginning, and the silence was only the start of something much more dangerous. The silence that filled the ballroom after the attack was so dense, it seemed it could be cut with a knife. Dozens of guests remained frozen in their seats, waiting for the man of the evening, the one whose wealth and influence had built the event they were attending, to finally stand up and bring order. Instead, his reaction was something none of them expected. The millionaire, Richard Lancaster, threw his head back and laughed. It was not a polite laugh meant to ease the tension. It was not the nervous laugh of a man trying to reassure the crowd. It was loud, mocking, and cold. The sound echoed off the marble walls. It bounced off the chandeliers, tearing through the fragile silence that enveloped the pregnant woman in her moment of humiliation. Gasps again swept through the room, softer this time, because no one could believe what they were hearing. A man whose wife had just been on the verge of falling to the floor was laughing as if the whole thing were a comedic spectacle prepared for his amusement. He clapped once, loudly, drawing even more attention to his grotesque display of delight. The pregnant woman remained still, her lips parted, her eyes wide with disbelief. Her whole body was shaking. She had endured many indignities before, many small humiliations swallowed in silence. But this was different. This was public. It was her own husband laughing at her pain in front of everyone she had ever considered a friend, business partner, or member of her social circle. Richard got up from his seat on the other side of the room and walked toward the table where his wife was. His suit shone under the lights. His cufflinks sparkled with every step. He moved with the arrogance of a man who believes the world itself bends to his will. The guests stepped aside. Some lowered their gaze. Others dared to look at the trembling woman who had just been attacked. When he reached her side, he placed his hand on the back of the chair and looked at her with contempt, not compassion. "You're too sensitive, Sarah," he said, loud enough for half the room to hear. "You need to stop making a scene. People came here to celebrate, not to watch you fall apart." The words fell like knives, piercing the fragile strength she had tried to maintain. Her hands gripped the tablecloth, her nails digging into the fabric. She wanted to scream, to tell him how cruel he was, but her throat closed up, sealing her voice. The mistress, a few feet away, smiled with satisfaction. Richard looked at her and smiled, a smile that said it all. "She didn't do anything wrong," he continued, pointing to the mistress. "You provoked her. You always do. Everyone here knows you're too emotional." The crowd shifted uncomfortably. Some lowered their gaze, ashamed to witness such open betrayal. Others whispered, shaking their heads, horrified by the spectacle. A man by the bar muttered, "Unbelievable," though he didn't dare to raise his voice. Sarah's face burned with humiliation. Her own husband was not only abandoning her, but supporting the woman who had attacked her. His laughter still echoed in her ears, each echo a lash against her pride. Richard stood tall and turned his back on her, raising his glass in a false toast to the mistress. "To those who are strong enough to face the truth," he said with arrogance. The mistress raised her chin and clinked her glass with his. A new silence fell over the room, not of surprise, but of collective judgment. Everyone had witnessed a betrayal so open and shameless that it would never be forgotten. Sarah lowered her gaze, her heart heavy, her body trembling. She thought she had known her husband's cruelty. Tonight he proved that he hadn't yet touched rock bottom. The air in the ballroom had changed. What began as a night of glamour now carried the stench of cruelty and betrayal. The millionaire's laughter still echoed in the minds of the guests. His cruel words floated in the subsequent silence, and in the center of it all was the mistress, with a smile that widened, her confidence growing with each passing second. She adjusted her dress with a gesture of manicured fingers, making sure the shiny fabric caught the light of the chandeliers. She wanted all eyes on her. She wanted to be seen not as an intruder or an aggressor, but as the woman who now reigned. The whispers, the gasps, the horrified looks, everything fed her pride. She advanced toward the pregnant woman, tilting her head, her eyes scanning the trembling woman in her chair. Her lips parted, and her voice cut the silence like a blade. "This is what happens when you hold on too tight. You lose. He chose me. Everyone can see it now." And that some guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats, unable to bear the venom of her tone. Sarah lowered her gaze, pressing her lips together to keep from breaking. Her hands clenched tightly in her lap, but she said nothing. Her silence only emboldened the mistress more. She turned slightly, raising her chin to the crowd, as if she were the hostess of the night and not an intruder. She took a delicate gold bracelet from her purse, raising it just enough for the closest guests to see. The jewel shone under the light, and a murmur ran through those present. They all recognized it. It was a piece that had belonged to Sarah, a family heirloom given years ago. "Pretty, isn't it?" the mistress murmured, looking back at Sarah. "It looks better on me than it does on her." She placed it on her wrist with exaggerated grace, savoring the indignation she perceived on some faces. The millionaire laughed again, raising his glass to her. "She deserves it," he said. "I always told you she never valued what she had." The mistress leaned toward him, triumphant. "And you value me, don't you?" "Of course," he replied without hesitation, his voice clear throughout the room. Sarah's heart sank, but she remained silent, rigid in her effort to contain the storm within her. The mistress turned back to the crowd, her voice louder, demanding attention. "You all heard him. He belongs to me. This is no longer her world. She has no place here." Her words sounded like a declaration, each syllable steeped in contempt. Phones were raised higher, guests recorded in silence, capturing the shameless arrogance on display. Some women shook their heads, whispering among themselves. A man in the back murmured, "This is going too far." No one dared to speak aloud. The mistress fed on the silence. For her, silence meant victory. She placed her hand on the millionaire's shoulder, marking her territory in front of everyone, challenging with her gaze anyone who opposed her. Sarah felt her throat close up. She wanted to stand up, scream, throw the bracelet in her face, but her legs were weak, and her strength was trapped under layers of humiliation. She remained motionless, trembling, desperately fighting to keep her spirit intact. The mistress leaned in one last time, her lips close to Sarah's ear. "You're finished," she whispered, though the whole room seemed to hear it. Then she straightened up, radiant and cruel. In her mind, the night belonged to her. In her mind, she had already won. But the silence of the crowd, the recording phones, and the looks heavy with judgment told another story. The arrogance she displayed was not a crown. It was a noose that was slowly tightening. Word after word, and cruel act after cruel act. The mistress's arrogant smile still hung in the air when the millionaire decided to act. Richard Lancaster was a man who had built his life on control. He controlled companies, markets, employees, and even friends. For him, people were chess pieces. And that night, in front of that audience, he planned to show that he still held the board in his hands. He stood tall, his champagne glass held high, as if his wife's humiliation were nothing more than entertainment. His voice cut through the uncomfortable silence, soft but loaded with threat. Enough whispers. Let me be clear. This is my event, and I decide what happens here." Several guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The weight of his words oppressed them like an invisible force. His eyes scanned the room, sharp and calculating, stopping on those holding their phones. "You think you can record me?" he said, his tone hardening. "But remember who I am. A single call, and each of you could lose more than your phone. Jobs, contracts, invitations, even your reputations. Do you really want to test me tonight?" A shudder of fear ran through the crowd. Some put their phones down immediately, ashamed or terrified. Others hesitated, their cameras still on, their hands trembling as they decided whether to keep recording. Sarah remained rigid, her hands clenched in her lap, her body trembling at the sound of that voice. She had heard it countless times, that tone of absolute authority that stripped people of their will. Only now it wasn't just against her, it was against the entire room. The mistress moved closer, sliding a possessive hand down his arm. She looked around, enjoying the attention, delighted to be by the side of the man who used fear as a weapon. "They know they shouldn't challenge you," she murmured, loud enough for others to hear. Richard smiled smugly, pleased with her approval. He pointed to a man in the back who hadn't put his phone down. "You, put it away," he barked. The man flinched, quickly lowered the device, and blushed with shame. Richard's voice lowered, but it kept its edge. "This won't leave this room. If it does, I'll know who to blame. And believe me, the consequences will be much worse than embarrassment." The silence grew deeper. It was no longer just uncomfortable, it was oppressive. The guests were trapped between fear and indignation, between decency and survival. Some looked at the trembling wife with compassion. Others avoided her eyes, afraid of being seen as allies. She felt the pang of loneliness more than ever. Her husband had turned her pain into a public spectacle, and now he was using his power to lock everyone in silence. She wanted to scream, to beg for someone to stand up for her, but the room seemed sealed under the weight of his threats. The mistress leaned toward Sarah, smiling with cruelty. "See how it works? No one will help you. They belong to him, just like you." The words hurt more than the kick to the chair, more than the laughter. They were a reminder of how alone she was in that moment. Richard raised his glass again and took a calm sip, as if nothing had happened. "Let's move on," he said in a serene tone, almost kind, but everyone heard the steel beneath his words. "There is no story here, just a misunderstanding, a private matter that will remain private." But no matter how much he tried to chain the truth with threats, the truth had already escaped. Phones had recorded. Eyes had seen. The arrogance of his power only deepened the cracks beneath his feet. The millionaire's threats still hung like storm clouds. The crowd remained rigid, trapped between fear and disgust at what they had witnessed. Some looked down at their plates. Others shifted uncomfortably, their hands clenched in their laps. The silence was oppressive, but into that silence, the mistress burst again, eager to push the humiliation further. Her heels echoed on the marble as she returned to the pregnant wife. Her smile had not faded. On the contrary, it was bolder. She fed on the attention, on the fact that no one had stopped her. For her, this was victory, and she wanted to savor it. She leaned in just enough for Sarah to smell the sharp perfume that emanated from her skin. Her voice was pure venom, loud enough for others to hear. "Look at you. Weak. Pathetic. You don't even defend yourself. No wonder he laughs at you." Sarah closed her eyes for an instant, holding back the burning tears. Her hands clenched tightly, her knuckles white. She felt her child move inside her, reminding her that she had to remain calm, that she had to resist, even if her body trembled. The mistress straightened up and turned to the crowd, as if performing on a stage. She spread her arms. She raised her voice. "Why should he stay with her?" she yelled, in a sharp and mocking tone. "She is nothing. She can't even hold his attention, or his respect, or his love. Tell me, what man would choose her over me?" Gasps broke the air, louder this time. A woman in the back covered her mouth with her hand. A man muttered, shaking his head, but no one got up. The silence that followed was not consent, but the mistress twisted it as proof of her dominance. The millionaire laughed again, raising his glass to her. "You're right," he said coldly. "You were always a burden, Sarah. You complicate everything. You embarrass me with your weakness." Sarah's heart broke as she heard her name spoken with such contempt. She had once believed in that voice when it promised love. Now it was a weapon that destroyed her in front of everyone. The mistress took advantage of the momentum. She leaned in again, and with a quick movement, snatched the delicate shawl from Sarah's shoulders, throwing it to the floor. "Even your clothes are wasted on you," she sneered. "They would look better in my closet." The shawl lay at Sarah's feet, like a symbol of stolen dignity. She slowly, with a trembling hand, reached down to pick it up. The room erupted in whispers. Phones were raised higher, recording every second of the cruelty. "Enough," an older guest muttered, though even he didn't move. The fear of the millionaire's threats kept everyone glued to their seats. The mistress turned to Sarah, tilting her head, her eyes shining with malice. "Say something," she provoked. "Defend yourself. Or are you too afraid, too pathetic?" Sarah slowly raised her head. Her eyes shone with tears, but inside a spark was beginning to ignite. She still didn't answer. She couldn't. But the silence was no longer weakness. It was a storm forming quietly, waiting for the right moment to erupt. The mistress mistook it for surrender. She turned to the millionaire, laughing, relishing what she believed was her final triumph. The room remained silent. But this time, the silence was different. It was heavier. It was dangerous. And it carried the weight of something that was about to change. The humiliation had reached its peak. Sarah trembled in her chair, the crumpled shawl in her lap. Her husband's laughter still echoed in her ears, and the cruel voice of the mistress burned in her memory. For a long moment she remained silent, the image of fragility that both of them wanted her to be. But in her chest, something changed. The shame that had kept her submissive began to transform into something stronger. She looked down at her belly, at the life moving inside her. To think that her child would grow up in a world where its mother remained silent, where she allowed cruelty to crush her without protest. It lit a fire inside her. She had endured for too long, believing that patience would protect her. This night had shown her that silence only fueled cruelty. If she didn't stand up now, she never would. Her hands stopped trembling. She gently placed the shawl on the table and pressed both palms against the surface, steadying herself. Slowly she raised her head. The room noticed it immediately. Conversations were cut short. Phones tilted forward. The trembling woman no longer trembled. The mistress tilted her head with a mocking smile. "Well, do you finally have something to say?" Sarah inhaled deeply. Her lungs filled with air that felt sharper and stronger than before. When she spoke, her voice was not loud, but it was firm. "Enough!" The word went through the room like a spark, lighting every corner in silence. The mistress blinked, surprised for an instant, and then laughed with mockery. "Enough? Do you think anyone will listen to you now? Look around. You're alone." Sarah got up from the chair. Her legs wavered, but she quickly steadied herself. One hand on the table, the other on her belly, with serene strength. She looked directly at her husband. Her voice grew in firmness. "I'm not alone. Not anymore. I won't let you humiliate me. Not in front of them. Not in front of our son. Not ever again." A murmur ran through the guests. They leaned forward, their eyes wide at her transformation. The trembling woman they had pitied had disappeared. In her place was someone who refused to break. The millionaire's smile faltered for just a second. His jaw hardened. "Sit down, Sarah," he ordered in a harsh, cutting voice. "No," she replied calmly, leaving no room for discussion. The mistress rolled her eyes with contempt. "Pathetic. Do you think your little speech means anything? He belongs to me. You are nothing." Sarah turned her gaze to the mistress, her eyes alight. "You hurt me once, and you thought I would stay quiet. But you forgot something. I'm stronger than your cruelty, and I'm stronger than his laughter." The words hit harder than a slap. The mistress wavered. Her smile cracked for the first time that night. The room erupted in louder whispers, no longer of pity, but of awe. Those who had been silenced by fear now murmured about courage, about strength, about the injustice they were witnessing. Sarah straightened her back, her chin held high. Her heart was beating hard, but no longer with fear. It was beating with defiance, with determination, with the fire of a woman pushed to the limit who had finally decided to resist. The millionaire squeezed his glass until a crack opened in the crystal. He had never expected her to stand up to him. Not there, not in front of everyone. For the first time that night, his laughter died. The mistress opened her mouth to launch another insult, but Sarah raised her hand and silenced her with just her presence. The room fell silent, expectant, holding its breath. Sarah's voice resonated once more, clear and unwavering. "This ends tonight." The final word still hung in the air. "This ends tonight." For a moment, no one moved. The mistress was paralyzed. Her smile turned into uncertainty. The millionaire clenched his jaw, trying to regain control. The guests held their breath, waiting for the next act of cruelty or the inevitable breakdown of order. Then, from the back of the room, the sound of heavy footsteps broke the silence. The doors opened, and several uniformed officers entered the room. Their presence cut through the attention like a blade. Radios crackled on their belts. The gleam of their badges reflected the light from the chandeliers. All eyes turned to them. The mistress let out a gasp. For the first time all evening, the color drained from her face. She took a half step back, still clinging to the millionaire's arm. But his confidence was wavering too. He had threatened the guests. He had ridiculed his wife. But even his arrogance knew the weight of the law when it entered the scene. The voice of the commanding officer was firm, clear, and loud enough to fill the room. "We received multiple calls about an assault in progress. Step aside." His gaze locked on the mistress, who crossed her arms as if that gesture could protect her from accountability. Sarah held her breath. Relief mixed with disbelief. She had endured so much humiliation that she almost couldn't believe someone had come to her defense. Around her, guests straightened up, their phones held high, recording every second as proof that the moment of justice had arrived. The officer advanced, pointing directly at the mistress. You assaulted a pregnant woman in front of witnesses. You're under arrest." A murmur ran through the room. The mistress shook her head, her voice high and trembling. "No, that's not true. She provoked me. She wanted it. Ask him. Ask Richard." All eyes fell on the millionaire. He opened his mouth, ready to lie, to twist the story in her favor. But his words were choked by the sight of a half-dozen raised phones, their screens glowing with the evidence. The guests had not obeyed his threats after all. The officer pointed to one of the people present. "Did you record this?" "Yes," the man replied firmly, his voice stronger than it had been all night. "We all saw what she did. We all heard his laughter. It's all on video." The mistress's composure crumbled. She tried to back away, but the officer grabbed her wrist and twisted it sharply. The metallic click of handcuffs echoed through the room, clear and undeniable. The crowd reacted immediately. Some gasped, others whispered, and a few clapped in silence. Sarah remained motionless, her eyes wide, her hands on her belly. She could barely process what was happening. After so much humiliation, seeing justice arrive so suddenly felt unreal. The mistress writhed in the officer's grip, screaming, "You can't do this! Do you know who he is?" She pointed at the millionaire, desperate to cling to his power. The officer did not hesitate. "I know perfectly well who he is, and tonight, that doesn't matter. What matters is that you committed an assault. You will have to answer for it." The millionaire's mouth set in a hard line. His hand clenched at his side, but he said nothing. His power had been everything until that moment. But as he watched his mistress being dragged toward the door, with her wrists bound in cold steel, he understood for the first time that his control was slipping through his fingers. Sarah's knees felt weak, but she remained standing, supported by the silent strength of the crowd around her. She didn't need to speak. The image of the mistress being escorted out spoke louder than any words. The ballroom had changed. What had begun as humiliation was now the beginning of justice. And for the first time all evening, Sarah allowed herself to breathe calmly, without hesitation. The echo of the handcuffs closing still hung in the air when silence returned to the ballroom. The mistress was being dragged toward the doors, her protests sharp and desperate. But no one came to her defense. The sound of her heels scraping against the marble was the last reminder of her arrogance. The crowd's attention immediately turned to the man who was left alone in the center of all eyes, Richard Lancaster. The millionaire, who had filled the room with laughter and confidence, now looked pale, his chest rising and falling too quickly, the champagne glass trembling in his hand. His mask of power, carefully built over years, was cracking in real time. For the first time all evening, the guests did not look away when they saw him. Their eyes were firm, sharp, and heavy with judgment. The phones that had been hidden at the edge of the tables were now pointed directly at him, capturing every nervous gesture, every bead of sweat that ran down his forehead. Richard tried to speak. He opened his mouth, his voice strained. "This is a misunderstanding. You're exaggerating. She provoked it. My wife always exaggerates." The words fell empty. No one nodded. No one believed him. The guests who had once politely smiled at his arrogance now turned away, murmuring with disgust. The weight of their disapproval fell on him harder than any judicial verdict. The pregnant woman remained upright in her chair, her hands firm on her belly. She did not speak. She didn't need to. The silence of her defiance was more powerful than his excuses. Her dignity, bruised but intact, contrasted with his decomposition. Richard's hand clenched the glass until it cracked, spilling champagne on his sleeve. The dry sound made him flinch. His confidence was crumbling further. He slammed the broken glass against the table, his face twisted with desperation. "You can't do this to me!" he yelled, his voice breaking. "I am Richard Lancaster. I built the profile of this city. I own half the businesses here. You can't turn against me." But they already had. A man by the bar spoke loud enough for everyone to hear. "We saw everything. We heard everything. You laughed while she suffered." Another voice rose from the crowd. "We won't forget." The murmurs grew, transforming into a storm of condemnation. Each voice was a knife that tore at his pride, stripping him of the illusion of control he had held for so long. Richard's face reddened. His chest heaved. His eyes looked toward the doors, as if seeking an escape. But there was none. The police were still there, firm at the edges of the room. Their presence was a silent warning. He was no longer above the law, no matter how loudly he shouted his name. The absence of the mistress was also a weight. The woman who had fed his arrogance, who had humiliated his wife at his side, was gone. Now her wrists were tied, and her voice was silenced. For the first time that night, he was truly alone. Richard's knees buckled slightly. His body betrayed the weakness he was trying to hide. He steadied himself on the table. His words came out softer, almost pleading. "You don't understand. It was just a moment. She exaggerated. Please, believe me." But Faith had abandoned the room long ago. What remained was evidence, witnesses, and a truth that could no longer be buried under money or threats. Sarah raised her head and looked at him. Her eyes were serene, not with anger, but with clarity. She no longer feared him. That look, firm and unwavering, crushed him more than any insult. Richard became rigid, motionless, his power shattered. The man who had laughed with cruelty now trembled under the gaze of justice. And although a verdict had not yet been handed down, everyone in the room knew that his empire was crumbling. The weight of the moment enveloped the room. Guests who had once whispered in fear now did so with judgment. The millionaire was frozen, pale, rigid, while the police remained at the doors as guardians of justice. The mistress was gone, her arrogance replaced by the cold metal of handcuffs. Only the silence of a reckoning remained. The pregnant woman stood straight, her hands on her belly. She had endured humiliation, betrayal, and cruelty, but she had also found her voice. Her defiance had changed everything. She was no longer the trembling woman who suffered in silence. She was the woman who had looked her abusers in the eyes and refused to bow. A soft murmur ran through the room as several guests stood up. First, a few, then more, all with their eyes fixed on her with respect. The phones were still held high, capturing every detail. But this time, not just as evidence. It was to spread the story of her strength. One of the officers approached, addressing her directly. His voice was firm but kind. "Ma'am, you're safe now. Do you need medical attention?" Her eyes shone, but she slowly shook her head. "No, I just need to get out of this place." The officer nodded. He extended his hand, but she didn't need it. She rested her palms on the table and stood up on her own. Her legs wavered, but the strength of her heart held her up. The guests moved aside, opening a clear path for her. Richard tried to speak. His voice was hoarse. "Sarah, wait. You can't leave like this. You need me. You always needed me." She turned her head slightly, fixing her gaze on him one last time. Her voice was calm, firm, and resolute. "I never needed your cruelty, and I never needed your laughter at my expense. What I needed was respect, and you never gave it to me." The words fell like a final verdict. Richard opened his mouth, but no sound came out. His empire, his control, and his power had been torn away in front of everyone. Sarah walked forward, her chin held high, her gaze unwavering. The guests stepped aside with reverence, some putting a hand to their chest, others whispering words of support. A woman in the front murmured, "She is stronger than all of them." Another added softly, "This is what true dignity means." The cameras captured her every step, the glow of the screens illuminating her path. What had begun as a night of humiliation ended as a story of resilience. Her image, walking tall in the midst of judgment, would spread beyond those walls. Upon reaching the doors, the officers opened them for her. The cool night air entered, sweeping away the stale smell of arrogance and fear. She inhaled deeply. the freshness filling her lungs as if it were freedom. She stopped on the threshold, one hand on her belly. Her child moved inside her, a small kick against her palm, reminding her that she was not alone. A faint smile appeared on her lips for the first time that night. She walked outside, leaving behind the glitter of the chandeliers and the echoes of cruelty. Ahead lay uncertainty, but it was hers, her future, her choice. She was no longer bound by silence or fear. She was free. Inside, Richard Lancaster remained trapped in the ballroom, surrounded by judgment, powerless against the truth. His empire was crumbling, but the woman he had tried to destroy was walking toward her liberation. And when the doors closed behind her, the story of that night was already taking shape. It was not the story of a mistress displaying arrogance or of a millionaire wielding power. It was the story of a woman who endured, who rose, and who walked away stronger than ever.